Okay, good morning, everyone. We are so happy that you could join us for today's online event. I am Amanda Turkey, the coordinator of school library services for the Santa Clara County Office of Education, and I love books. Let's hear it for books. Raise your hands in the air and wave them around if you like books. Awesome. Thank you for joining us for this author visit during Read Across America Month. So I don't know if you know this, but each year on March 2nd, we celebrate the Read Across America, and it's a day of reading for everyone. That was last Sunday, and since we couldn't be together, we decided to celebrate for the whole month. This is a time when millions of people across the country, including you, will make time in their days to read together, and doing exciting reading at home, at school, after school. And through reading, we learn, we use our imaginations, and we have fun. So I hope that you've had time, find time to read with your family, with your friends, with your pets. If you've never read to your dog or your cat, you are really missing out. During March, all during March, you need to read to them for National Read Across America Month and every day after. And I would like to let teachers and students know that you are welcome once Mr. Brown has finished chatting to put questions in the Q&A tab on the Zoom. We've already gotten 2 pages of questions from students. We're so excited, and he's going to answer them after he tells us a little bit about his book. So next, I would like to introduce our Assistant Superintendent of Educational Progress, Dr. Debbie Gorgulo, who is going to introduce our author for today's visit.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Debbie Gorgulo and I'm so excited to be here with you today. I work at the Santa Clara County Office of Education, or SCCOE for short. That's a big name, but basically, we help support schools and teachers all across Santa Clara County so that students like you have great learning opportunities. Thank you for being part of Silicon Valley Reads. This is such a cool program because it gives all of us a chance to read the same books and think about big ideas together. This year's theme is all about technology, things like robots and artificial intelligence, and how they can help make the world a better place. Pretty cool, right? One of the books you've been reading is The Wild Robot by Peter Brown. It's about a robot named Roz who gets stranded on a wild island. At first, she doesn't know how to survive, but she learns from the animals and even becomes part of their community. But things get tricky when her past comes back to shake things up. Now, I get to introduce you to the amazing author behind this book. Peter Brown has been writing and illustrating stories since he was a kid, 6 years old to be exact. Do you remember when you were 6 years old?
Thank you so much, Dr. Gorgulo. Without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Mr. Peter Brown.
How's everybody doing today? I am so glad to be with you. I'm Peter Brown. I'm an author. I'm an illustrator, and I'm coming to you from far away. I live in Maine, which, if you look at a map of the United States, is the upper right-hand corner of America. And so you're all the way on the left side of that map, far, far away. And it's just really cool, thanks to technology, that we can all be hanging out together this morning for you, and it's afternoon for me. Um, I'm an author and an illustrator, and I want to talk to you today about some of the work that goes into making books. I'm going to give you like a slideshow presentation. I'm going to do a little drawing demonstration at the end. So if any of you really like to draw like I do, you might want to grab something to draw with and a piece of paper, and I can kind of walk you through a drawing. We can draw together towards the end. At the very end, we'll have a few minutes for question and answer. And I know there's been a bunch of questions that have been submitted already, but if something comes up in your mind and you feel like asking a question, you can enter that in the chat, and we'll get to as many questions as we can at the end. But for now, I would like to share my screen so that I can do this little presentation for you. So give me 1 second here as I get this all set up. Share. Okay, so you should see a screen filled with book covers. Those are a bunch of the books that I've written and illustrated over the years. a lot of picture books. But today, actually, given with the theme of technology that you're all focused on right now, of course, I think it makes sense for me to focus on one book in particular, and that book is my book, The Wild Robot. And actually, in order to talk to you about The Wild Robot, I really have to begin with one of my picture books called The Curious Garden, because I had the idea for The Wild Robot while I was working on The Curious Garden. I get ideas for stories all over the place. I never really know when an idea is going to pop up into my mind. And sometimes I get ideas while I'm walking through the woods or when I'm reading a book. In this case, I got an idea for a story while I was writing and illustrating this picture book, The Curious Garden. Um, so, The Curious Garden is about a boy who lives in a gray, dreary city where there's no parks or gardens. And he finds these little wildflowers growing and he just decides to take care of them and become a gardener. And he does a really good job. And by the end of that story, the that gray, dreary city has been transformed into this beautiful garden city. So what we're looking at right here is the cover of that book, and what we see is basically a painting that I made. Here's the actual painting that I painted for the illustration for the cover of this book. I painted this picture. I sent it off to the publisher that I work with. I can't make these books all by myself. I have to work with publishing companies, and they photograph my painting and they print it on the cover of the book. And they added the title at the top and my name at the bottom. Now, I don't automatically know what I want a book cover to look like. I didn't just sit down one day and bang out this painting off the top of my head. No, I had to plan it ahead of time. And I do that by sketching, usually with pencil on paper. And for this book, I probably made 40 or 50 different sketches as I tried to imagine all the different ways I could illustrate the cover of this book. I liked this sketch best of all. So then eventually I got out my paints and my brushes and I made a painting that looked a lot like the sketch we see on the screen here. Now, I don't just plan and sketch the cover of each book. I plan and sketch every page of every book. That's most of the work that I do. For this book, I was sketching a lot of scenes like these, kind of unusual scenes, I guess, of like natural things and unnatural things together. For example, on the left side of the screen here, we see this old abandoned industrial building that has become overgrown with weeds and vines. And it was while I was imagining these kinds of scenes for The Curious Garden that for some reason I drew a picture of a robot in a tree, which didn't have a whole lot to do with The Curious Garden, although it had a lot to do with those themes of natural things and unnatural things together in the same space. I mean, a robot seems like kind of an unnatural thing, and a tree seems like just about the most natural thing I can think of. You put those two together, like I did in this little drawing, and it kind of seems like there's an interesting story in there. I want to know more about this robot. The problem was I was working on The Curious Garden, remember? So I had to put my robot drawing away, try to stay focused, Peter, keep writing and planning and sketching every page of this picture book. And then eventually I sat down and painted all of the illustrations that you see when you pick up the actual book. I don't always paint my illustrations, but I did for this book. And eventually I finished all the art, all the words, and the book was published. But in my free time, when I wasn't working on The Curious Garden, I kept thinking about that robot, you know? Funny questions began popping into my mind. Questions like, why would a robot be in a tree in the first place? How would a robot adapt to life in the wilderness? What would a wild animal think if they saw a robot marching through the woods? The questions kept coming, and I was really excited about telling some sort of a robot nature story. However, I had more picture books to make. Each of my picture books takes me almost a year of my life, sometimes more than a year of my life. I usually know what the next few book projects will be, which means I usually know how I'm going to spend the next few years of my life. So even though I was really excited about that robot story, I had to first spend about 5 years writing and illustrating all of these different books. But eventually I had time in my schedule to get serious about this robot story, and I began imagining more scenes of a robot in the wilderness and sketching them in my sketchbook. I thought to myself, if I'm going to tell a robot nature story, I need to learn about real robots and real nature. So I started reading everything I could find about robotics, about artificial intelligence. I was reading about nature, subjects like animal behavior and ecology. I was reading a lot of science fiction. I've always loved science fiction, stories that usually take place in the future. They involve maybe robots or space travel, advanced technology. But I began to study science fiction to see what I could learn from like the best sci-fi ever written. I was learning so much cool stuff about real robots, about fictitious robots, about nature, that I started to realize this story I was working on was not going to be another picture book. At first, I thought The Wild Robot would be a picture book because that's the only kind of book I'd ever made at that point. This story was bigger than anything I'd ever come up with before. It was a bigger story, bigger ideas. I needed to do a lot more research. This was going to have to be my very first novel for kids. So I started reading great novels for kids for inspiration. One of my favorites is called Hatchet by Gary Paulson, about a boy who finds himself stranded in the wilderness and he must figure out how to survive all by himself, which is kind of a scary idea, but it's a beautiful story, a beautifully written story. It's a survival story, which got me thinking maybe my robot nature story should really be a robot survival story, the story of a robot struggling to survive deep in the heart of the wilderness. That sounded pretty exciting to me. I would read a book like that. I was a little worried somebody had already written a book like that, but I went to the library and did some research and realized that no, nobody had already written the kind of robot survival story that I wanted to tell. And that's when I knew I had to make The Wild Robot. And it all kind of came down to one big question that I wanted to answer. And the question was this: what would an intelligent robot do alone in the wilderness? There's no other robots around, there's no people around, just one robot alone in the wilderness. What happens? Well, to answer that question, I invented a character, Roz the robot. One of the first things I had to do is figure out what is Roz going to look like. I began imagining simple little designs and sketching them in my sketchbook. And the truth is that robots can look like almost anything. Here are two famous robotic characters from the movies. On the left, we have C3PO, who kind of looks like a person, right? He's got a head and a body and arms and legs. On the right, we have R2D2, who looks a little bit like my trash can on wheels. No disrespect, I love R2, but he does look like my trash can. So in my research, I went to laboratories and met with real scientists who were building real robots that looked like all sorts of things. I saw real robots that looked kind of like dogs, that looked kind of like spiders. I saw a robot that looked like a submarine. I mean, the truth is, a robot could look like anything. I decided to keep my character Roz pretty simple. This is what I came up with. And I did that on purpose. The idea that I was really excited about was to imagine how a robot would adapt to life in the wilderness. Roz is going to have to learn how to hide in the weeds and how to climb trees and how to run away from bears, among many other things. It's kind of hard to imagine a trash can on wheels climbing a tree. But I could imagine this robot doing those types of outdoor activities. I was also a little worried that readers would have a hard time caring about a robot for a whole book, especially if that robot looked like something, I don't know, hard to relate to, like, say, a submarine. It's kind of hard to relate to a submarine and connect with that type of technology on a personal level. But if the robot looks a little bit like a person with a head and a body and arms and legs, we can kind of understand what she's experiencing and how she's moving through the wilderness. And maybe that would help readers care about my character. I started thinking about the setting for the story. And I thought, an island was perfect, right? Roz is stranded on this island. She has no choice but to figure out how to survive. But where's that island going to be? I thought it's got to be really rugged. It's got to have a lot of nature, it's got to have all four seasons, a lot different kinds of plants and trees. And I thought maybe an island off the coast of Alaska or Canada, someplace like that would be good. And of course, in the middle of that rugged island wilderness, there's going to be animals. And so I thought about the different types of animals Roz might come across. But I mean, how is Roz going to have any sort of meaningful interactions with animals? Surely this robot cannot speak with animals. That sounds ridiculous. Or is it? And that got me thinking, well, hold on a second. Maybe that's possible. I mean, I bet Roz has very different needs than a person would have. I bet Roz doesn't need to eat food or drink water or breathe air or sleep. Maybe she doesn't need to close her eyes at all. And that got me thinking, what would happen if Roz were to camouflage herself, cover herself in like mud and weeds, and she could hide in the wilderness better than any person ever could. She could study the animals more closely than any person ever could. And maybe she could learn lessons that no person ever could. So this is an illustration from the book. That's what happens. Roz camouflages herself and then she sits down in this meadow and just kind of blends into the landscape, just sort of disappears. And she sits in that place for weeks, maybe a month, and doesn't move at all. She never falls asleep. She never closes her eyes. She sees every little thing that happens in that meadow for a whole month, and she remembers everything perfectly in her computer brain. And what happens is she begins to notice the same bird flies down to the same rock and sings the same song every morning. Every after a while, she can kind of predict what that bird is going to do and when and why. Not just the bird, though, all the animals, the deer that come grazing through the meadow every evening, and the different insects and all the other creatures that come through this meadow. Roz can really predict what they're going to do. A lot of their noises and movements kind of start making sense to her. And she can recreate a lot of those same noises and movements. And so Roz ends up learning to speak with the animals. And once she can do that, she can make friends, even a family. But most important to me was that she could learn from them, because every animal is like an expert at a certain kind of survival. Some animals migrate, some animals hibernate over the winter, some animals live in big groups, others live all by themselves, and they do all these different things to survive. And I thought Roz could learn a whole lot about survival if she could communicate and have conversations with these animals, including a little baby goose, a little gosling like this one. It doesn't seem like a big, strong robot would have much to learn from a little gosling, but that's what happens in the story. I'm going to try not to give too much away in case people listening haven't read the book yet, but I'm going to mention a few things here. So there's this big accident in the story, and Roz comes across this orphaned gosling who has no family of his own. He hasn't even hatched from his egg. Uh, Roz finds a goose egg sitting on the forest floor, and she picks it up and she builds it a little nest. And the next day, that egg hatches. Here's a sketch of that scene, not the finished art. That's a sketch. This egg hatches. This gosling breaks out of his eggshell for the and looks out at the world. And the first thing she ever sees he sees in his entire life is Roz the robot looking back. This gosling breaks out of his egg and sees this robot looking at him and just figures this creature must be his mother. So he calls her Mama. And Roz understands, and she can't abandon him now. So Roz adopts this little gosling as her son and names him Bright Bill. There he is, a bit more grown up. So together, Roz and Bright Bill have an unusual but a really interesting and sweet little family out there in the wilderness. Well, as you can imagine, as I was researching and thinking, and I was writing down notes in my notebook, and I was typing things up on my computer, but there comes a point in this whole creative process when I have to decide what happens first in my story, what happens second, what happens third, what happens every little step of the way throughout the entire plot of my story. It can be a little overwhelming because I have a lot of ideas. How do you make sense of them? What do I do with this notebook filled with notes? What am I supposed to do with all these notes? Well, it can be a lot, right? So I do this thing that I call story mapping. A million things can happen in my story, and I just start writing down little moments that could possibly happen in my story. And I'll circle a little moment, and then I'll draw an arrow from that moment to a different moment, and then to another one, and to another one. I can easily compare and contrast two possible story moments, and maybe I like one better than the other. So I'll cross off the one I don't like, and I'll kind of keep going with the one I do like. I do this over and over and over again. It's a difficult process to explain, but the idea is I'm getting these thoughts out of my head onto the page. I can rearrange my little ideas and kind of look at them in new ways and think about them differently and start to make sense of all of these little moments and put them in the right order. And eventually, through this messy process, I figure out exactly what I want to happen every little step of the way throughout the entire story. And then I start to write. I start to write the first draft of the story or first version of the story. And I know it doesn't have to be perfect, because I'm going to hand this off to my publisher, and they're going to give me feedback on what I've written, and then I'll make edits and revisions, and it'll gradually get better and better. So the first draft, it can be a little messy. That's okay. And I think this is the first draft, and I sent this off to my publisher, and they got back to me, the little green and red kind of bubble things on the side there. Those are comments to me about what I've written. They might correct bad grammar. They might suggest I change a character's name. Near the middle of the screen here, they highlighted one sentence, and the comment was just one word. The word is cut with a question mark, which is my editor's polite way of saying, Peter, I think you should get rid of this sentence. She says all that with just one word, cut question mark. She might highlight an entire chapter and say cut question mark, which can kind of hurt if you like that chapter. But sometimes it's the right thing to do. If there's an entire chapter that is really unnecessary to the story, you got to get rid of it. I don't want to waste people's time. So sometimes you have to make those tough decisions. I'm also an illustrator, and I wanted this book to have lots of illustrations sprinkled throughout. So as I began to figure out the story, I started to imagine which scenes would be good to illustrate. I have to kind of pick and choose which scenes. Here's a sketch of one of the very first scenes in the whole story when Roz first arrives on the island, and she eventually pries herself out of this crate and looks around and realizes that she's all alone on this island, or so she thinks. Here's some more sketches. There's a big storm scene. There's a lot of animal characters. I spend a lot of time sketching and planning the cover of the book, of all of my books. A good book cover will make somebody walk across the library and pick up that book to check it out. That is what you want to happen. You cannot rush the design of your book cover. It could be a very bad mistake. Here's a couple designs I came up with, which weren't quite right, but they helped me eventually figure out what I wanted the cover of the book to look like. So eventually, I finish all of the sketches for the whole book for every illustration that I'm eventually going to make. I send those sketches to my publisher, and they start building this computer file that kind of looks like a book. Here we see it says chapter 4, which is called The Robot Hatches. And then there's 2 paragraphs of words, and then there's a little number 8 under that second paragraph because that's page 8 of the book. The facing page is that sketch, which we'll replace with a finished illustration a little later. Down below is chapter 5. So what we see there is all of chapter 4. It's just half a page of words and an illustration. It's a pretty short chapter. I want to show you how I make a finished illustration, the illustration for the cover of the book. Here's a picture of my desk where I work. You can see there's some paintbrushes there, and there's a white bucket that's filled with kind of dirty water because I've been painting with black ink and then cleaning off my brushes in that bucket of water. And now the water's kind of dirty. There's a piece of paper on the desk there with these black splotchy marks on it. The cover art for the Wild Robot is in full color, but it's actually starts off with me just painting simple shapes with black ink on white pieces of paper. I painted a lot of pages like this. It's just a bunch of tall triangles, nothing too complicated. But you put a bunch of tall triangles together, and it starts looking a little bit like maybe some sort of a pine tree forest, or I don't know, maybe some mountains. It's a little hard to say at the moment, but you can imagine how those triangles could possibly turn into something else. I painted a lot of pages like this, just these kind of inky, blobby shapes. Certain details I would draw with pencil on paper. So I end up with all these really simple little drawings and paintings on paper. And then I use a scanner, like a fancy camera connected to my computer. I scan all of those pictures into my computer, and now I can start working with those simple shapes and drawings and layering them together to create my illustration. The gray rectangle in the middle of the screen right now, that's the background. I'm going to lay simple shapes over top of it to create my illustration, starting with these inky shapes there, those dark shapes. Now, those are supposed to be clouds, and we sometimes see dark clouds in the sky, but this is not supposed to be a stormy scene. So using my computer, I will change the clouds from black to white. I'm going to add a little squiggly circle in the upper right-hand corner. Um, that's going to be the sun. Kind of hard to see. We'll come back to that. That dark area at the bottom is water. It doesn't really look like water. So I'm going to add a layer of these little wavy lines that I drew with pencil. And now that's starting to look like water at the bottom. Here's a big layer of triangles. We're not quite sure what those triangles are. They're actually supposed to be like evergreen trees, but they don't quite look like that yet. So I'm going to add more foresty details. And now that's starting to look kind of like a forest. And here's a big layer of rocky shapes. So you can see what's happening. There's water in the foreground, a rocky coastline with a forest behind the rocks and the sky behind the trees. And there's Roz. Now she's just on one slide here to kind of speed things up, but she made up of different simple shapes that I painted individually, and then I put them together in just the right place so they look like Roz. And there's the title. I don't really worry about the color until the end. Once every shape is in just the right place, which I can move all these shapes around individually in using my computer, I can also select each shape and change its color. And I did that, and I played around with the color until it looked like this. So here is the finished front cover art for the book. Although I don't just think about the front cover, I actually think about the whole book jacket that kind of wraps around the book. And here's the art just by itself. So using that same process, I make finished illustrations based on all of the sketches throughout the whole book. You saw this sketch earlier where here's the finished art. The interior illustrations on a lot of novels are not in color, and that was true of my book too. But I think they look kind of cool in black and white. Here's some more illustrations. There's Roz riding on the back of a grizzly bear with her son Brightbill on the shoulders of the bear, and they're leading this parade of animals across the island. The problem with adopting a goose for a son is that geese have instincts that tell them to fly south for winter. Um, and there comes a moment when Roz realizes she has to let her son Brightbill follow his natural instincts and fly south for winter. She's stuck on the island, but he's not. And so this is kind of a sad moment because they have to say goodbye for the very first time. And she climbs to the top of this old tree and watches as all the geese fly south together. All right, so eventually I finish all the illustrations throughout the whole book. I send them to the publisher. They go through this file we saw earlier, replacing the sketches with the finished art throughout the whole book. We get all the words just right, all the pictures are just right. My job is done. The book is ready to be printed. So they send this computer file to a printing press, which is like a factory that makes books, and sometimes they make my books. And so now you know a little bit more about how and why I made The Wild Robot. And it all started with a drawing of a robot in a tree. If you read The Wild Robot and enjoy it, there is a sequel called The Wild Robot Escapes. And there's actually a third book called The Wild Robot Protects, which came out about a little over a year ago. So there's a whole trilogy. And there's actually, maybe you've heard, there's also a Wild Robot movie that came out in the fall based on my book. And the truth is, I didn't have a whole lot to do with the movie because, for a lot of reasons. One of them is that I live in Maine and the movie was made in Los Angeles, which is about as far away as you can get from Maine and still be in America. And it just didn't really make sense for me to be involved. But I had a lot of conversations with the director of the movie and the producer. We would have to get on these Zoom calls and talk for hours about my story, my writing, my research, my thinking. They would show me what they were working on. And so over the course of about 4 years, which is about how long it takes to make most animated movies, we had a lot of conversations. So I was a little bit involved, but I was never at the studio working on the movie. Anytime a book is turned into a movie, things have to change, at least a little bit. And so there were definitely changes between the book and the movie. One of the changes is that the Roz in the movie looks a little different than my Roz in the book. And there's some good reasons for that. The filmmakers explained to me that what they wanted was for Roz to move over the course of the story more and more like an animal and more with more natural movements. And they really needed her head to be able to like twist and turn and do different things. The way I designed Roz, her head movement is kind of limited. And so they wanted to free up her head so she could really be expressive with her body language. And that made a lot of sense to me. Um, and so that change happened, and I could totally understand why. Aside from that, they really look pretty similar. They both have rounded bodies and long arms and legs and two glowing eyes. And, considering that a robot could look like a submarine or a spider, I feel like they stayed pretty true to my design. Some of the changes they made, I liked, like this one. Some of the changes they made, I didn't love. I don't have to get into all the specifics, but it's a little weird to see my story turned into this other thing, but it's also very exciting. So it's been a learning process, and it's been really thrilling for me because I love movies and I love animation in particular. So um, it's been a whole wild adventure for me to watch this movie happen. Um, Real quickly, I'm almost done here, but when a book is turned into a movie, a lot of times they'll publish a new version of that book with art from the movie on the cover. The hope is that somebody who loves the movie but hasn't read the book might go into a bookstore and see that book on the right side of your screen and remember that they love the movie and want to pick it up and read the book that inspired the movie. That's what we hope happens. But those two books that we see on the screen right now, those are the same exact book. Aside from the cover, everything else is the same. The words on the inside are the same. The illustrations on the inside are the same. So don't be confused. Those are what you see here are two versions of the same book. The last thing I want to mention is that my next book coming out in June is a Wild Robot picture book called The Wild Robot on the Island. And I really wanted to bring Roz's world on the island with Brightbill to life with big, full color, detailed illustrations, kind of showing readers Roz's world in a new way. And so I had a lot of fun with color and lighting and composition and really tried to make kind of beautiful scenery and make this an experience that fans of the novels will appreciate. And also, maybe this is a way to introduce younger readers to Roz for the very first time, and then they can go from this picture book to the novels. Of course, Brightbill, the goose, is a big part of the story too. So, all right, I'm going to stop staring at my screen because I feel like drawing a picture. That's what I'm going to do right here. If you would like to join me, you are more than welcome to, or you can just sit back and watch if you want. That's cool too. I talked to you a little bit about how I made the art for the book. Today I'm going to do a drawing with markers, so it'll look a little different than the art you see in the book, but you'll still kind of get a sense of how I think. And let me see, let me get the camera kind of focused on the pad of paper. If you happen to be drawing with me, maybe you're using a pencil. That's cool. I love pencil drawing. I would encourage you to start by pressing lightly on your pencil to create light marks on the page. And and then later we can press a little harder on that pencil to create darker marks. That way we can kind of plan our drawing, and we're going to start with a half circle in the middle of the page. I'm using a light gray marker to begin. And I do that because I can make a mistake at that point, at this point of the drawing, and that mistake won't really show up when it's all over because it's a light marker. You'll see. We're going to trace over this with black ink a little bit in a minute. So Roz's body is a half circle. Her head is kind of a rectangle that sits on top. Her arms are going to hang straight down at her sides from these corners of her shoulders. Her hands are just these kind of circle shapes at the ends of her arms. We'll have Roz running through the wilderness, and she's got these long, bendy legs. So I draw these curving lines like this. Her feet are just kind of like rectangles at the ends of her legs. One leg is swinging forward, the other one is swinging back. All right. Okay, I'm going to fix that. It doesn't look quite right to me. That's what I'm talking about. I can make a little mistake while I'm sketching, and when this is all done, you won't even really notice all that. Um, let's see. I'm going to put a big circle up here in this corner. That's where it's a sunny day. And then Roz is going to be hopping over some rocks. So I'm going to make these kind of lumpy shapes on the ground. Rocks can kind of look like anything. All right, that looks pretty good. I know where everything's going to go. I can put my light gray marker away, grab my black marker. If you are drawing and you're using pencil, at this point, I would recommend you start pressing a little harder on your pencil to create darker lines, but don't press so hard that you break your pencil point. All right, I'm just really kind of tracing over the sketch that I made, one line at a time. Being careful to get the legs and the arms right. This arm is in front of this leg, and this leg is in front of this arm. So you got to kind of think a little bit about how they interact with each other there. And I don't need these lines to be perfect. In fact, I kind of like the lines to be a little bit wobbly. Let's see. Now I'm confusing myself. Arm, leg, leg, arm, right. I like the lines to be a little bit wobbly because life in the wilderness is not easy for Roz. In the book, she falls out of trees and she gets stuck in storms and she gets attacked by bears. And every time one of those things happens, she gets more scrapes, scratches, and they start adding up. So as I'm drawing Roz, it's okay if her lines are like a little wobbly. Just makes it clear that she's no longer a brand new shiny robot. All right, her eyes are circled. So I do two circles up here. And she's got a mouth, although she doesn't eat with her mouth, but she talks with it. I'm going to outline the rocks down below here that she's hopping over. Okay, looking pretty good. I'll put that away. I'm going to get another marker, gray marker, to do some shading. Shading is all about shadows, and you can't really draw shadows unless you know where the light source is in your scene. Well, I put a circle up here for the sun. So the sun must be kind of moving this way across the scene. And I think about the direction of the sunlight, and I think about the different shapes that make up Roz's body, and I try to imagine where the shadows would go. Roz's arms and legs are kind of like tube shaped. So I think, all right, if a tube is bending this way and the light is coming from this angle, where would the shadows be? Just a little hint of a dark underside here kind of gives the idea that Roz is like a three-dimensional character, that there's a light side and a shadowy side. All right, and I'll do some shading on the rocks. The rocks probably have a kind of a rough surface, right? So I put a few little marks here and there, and it just gives the idea that there's kind of a texture to the rocks. One thing I love to do when I draw characters running outside is I just put a few dots behind their feet, and it looks like they're kicking up dirt as they run. All right, that's looking pretty good. I'm going to add a little color. You may not have color, that's fine. Just keep drawing with whatever you've got. But I'm gonna put these little green lines on the ground. There's plants, grasses, weeds, and stuff growing here and there. Doesn't really matter where these lines go. I just want to get the idea that Roz is out somewhere where there's little growing things all over the place. I'll add some kind of ferns, like a straight stem with leaves on either side. Maybe there's a tall one over here. All right. I'm going to add a tree. Some of my trees are just tall green triangles. This is going to be a straight line for my tree trunk. And you notice I left a gap in that tree, in that line here. That makes it look like Roz is in the foreground and the tree is in the background. So that's my tree trunk. Very simple, just a line. And then off of that, I'll draw these branches. Very simple, kind of curving lines here and there. But simple is good. It looks like some sort of an evergreen tree. I'll draw another smaller one right here. All right. I'm actually going to grab my black marker again to add just a few more little dark details. I like it. I like darker details just to kind of even things out, show a little bit of contrast here and there. All right, I've got one color left. Might be my favorite color of them all. Pink. I love pink. Pink is beautiful all by itself, but what I love most about pink is the effect that it has on other colors, especially green. If you put pink near green, it actually makes green look greener, which is kind of cool when you think about it. That one color can help another color be even more itself. I love that. A lot of my stories take place out in nature with a lot of greenery. And so I like to add pink details to make the green really pop. And so why not have a pink sun in the sky? That's cool. And I'll put these little pink dots on the ground, like, I don't know, maybe there's little wildflowers growing here and there. And that it all just kind of makes the color much more interesting. And then the last thing I do is I sign my name. My name is Peter Brown, but I like to sign my name in pink when I can. And that's how you draw Roz running through the wilderness. Let me give you a little close up here. Pretty simple stuff. Nothing, no part of this drawing is very complicated. You know, one of the keys to drawing is learning how to take simple things and put them together in an interesting way. That's what I like to do. So the next time you try drawing something, anything, does not have to be Roz. It can be anything. Think about using simple lines and simple shapes, even simple colors. Maybe limit yourself to just a couple of colors and see what happens. I find that if I force myself to use to simplify things, it usually turns out pretty well. I think it might turn out well for you too. All right, well, we've just got a few minutes left, but I think there's some questions. So why don't we answer some questions?
Thank you so much, Mr. Brown. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. I love Roz jumping over the rocks. You answered a lot of the questions. You told us it takes about a year for you to write a book.
My
So
picture books, yes.
your picture books.
The Wild Robot took a lot longer because it was my first novel, and I was nervous and took my time, and I had a lot of figuring out to do. So the Wild Robot, I probably spent more like 2.5 years on the Wild Robot. But yeah, it's these. None of these books happen quickly. I'm pretty slow. I'm pretty slow.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask too. Some of our kids wanted to know what comes first, the drawing or the words?
Well, in this case, I showed you that drawing of a robot in a tree that I made while working on the Curious Garden. And that's what got the whole thing started. I just couldn't stop wondering what a robot would do, why a robot would be in a tree, and what a robot would do in the wilderness. And that it all stemmed from that initial little drawing. Um, but other times I'll have ideas for stories that begin with words, you know. I never really know. It could be a sentence or a drawing. Yeah. So as an author and an illustrator, I it's a lot of work, but it's also I feel kind of fortunate because my ideas could literally come from anywhere, you know, visually or from words or, you know, I get ideas all over the place. And so um yeah, it's just kind of a free for all.
Great, thank you. People want to know, now I know you said you are coming out with a picture book around the Wild Robot, but are you going to come out with another chapter book in the Wild Robot series?
Yeah, I think so. I have this idea for a fourth Wild Robot novel that I'm very excited about. So I'm just getting started, and these things take a long time, and the publishing process is slow. So I haven't been talking about it a whole lot just because it's probably going to be a couple years before this book is published. But if you're patient and you're interested, you know, stay tuned. And I do think there's going to be a fourth Wild Robot novel eventually. Hopefully, I'll do it as quickly as I can. But one of the reasons I'm so slow is because I love this story and I love this character and all the characters. And I don't want to rush things and make mistakes. I'd rather be slow and take my time and get it just right. And so far, that's worked pretty well for the Wild Robot series. So forgive me for being a slow author, but hopefully you think it's worth it in the end.
Well, 100% it is worth it. Um, I think this kind of segues nicely into one of our next questions, which is kids really want to know what happens. Do you get writer's block or do you get frustrated or mad
Mm.
sometimes when you're writing your
Oh,
books?
yeah. Oh my gosh, all the time. I mean, not writer's block so much. Because I'm an author and an illustrator, I have the luxury of kind of bouncing back and forth between writing and illustrating. So if I'm starting to feel a little bit stuck with writing, I might spend the day drawing instead. And that usually kind of loosens things up. Or might spend the day reading. Sometimes I'll even spend the day watching movies because, a book like the series like The Wild Robot, there's a lot of science in the books. There's a lot of nature, there's a lot of technology, and even though it's wrapped up in kind of an adventure story, I really wanted the science to be pretty real and pretty accurate. And so I'll watch like documentary films about robotics or about about nature or animals or whatever. Um, and so when I do find myself getting stuck, I have a lot of different things I can do to kind of get myself unstuck. Um, so there's that. And then do I get I mean, there's ups and downs, there's a lot of ups and downs. I love my job, but there are hard days when I don't know if what I'm doing is going to work. There's times when I realize I have to cut a big scene. I might have spent like a month on one scene trying to get it just right. And then eventually, after the end of that month, I'm like, you know what? This just isn't working. I have to just get rid of this whole thing. There goes a whole month of my life, a whole month of my work time out the window, right? Now, I wouldn't call it a complete waste because I'd probably learn some things during that month that are useful, but it can be hard to make those tough decisions of letting go of stuff. And those can be rough days for me emotionally because I feel like, what am I doing? What kind of an author am I that I wasted a whole month of my time? So, yes, there's definitely ups and downs.
Excellent. Thank you. So, speaking of that, the fact that you're an author and an illustrator, some of our students want to know if you've ever considered making a graphic novel.
I haven't really. I get that question all the time. I know everybody wants graphic novels, but like not everybody is built to make graphic novels. And because I'm so slow and I'm so deliberate, I take my time and I do all this research and I really overthink things, there's no time for that in a graphic novel. A graphic novel is so much, there's so many words, there's so many pictures I mean, and a lot of words. There's just a lot of planning. It's just a big book, it's a big thing, and I'm slow and I feel like what I'm doing right now is working pretty well. And so I don't see myself making a graphic novel anytime soon. But I make novels with illustrations, which I think is probably the next best thing. So
Absolutely. Thank you. And so, okay, there are a couple that we have literally pages. So I'm just going to try to ask you some of the questions that you haven't answered so far. And one of the questions we have is, do you have to go to college to be an author?
Well, I don't know if I'd say you have to go to college. I went to college, and that certainly helped. I went to college and I studied illustration. I went to art school, art college, and took some creative writing classes there and some classes on how to write and illustrate picture books. And that was really helpful and helped me figure out what kind of an author artist I wanted to be. But I'm sure it's possible for somebody who's very talented and hardworking and motivated and focused, to know exactly what they want to do and to develop those skills. I didn't really start writing seriously until I was in college. But if I had started writing seriously as a 10-year-old, who knows? Maybe by the time I finished high school, I would be ready to get a book published. I guess it's possible. But for 99% of writers, I do think college is really helpful because you learn how to write, you learn how to organize your thoughts, you learn how to research, you learn all the nuts and bolts about making a career as an author. You can learn that stuff in college. And so I think it's pretty helpful for most people. I think that's probably the way to go.
Well, and I bet most of our students didn't realize how much research you did. That was impressive to see those
Yeah.
3 piles of books that you looked at in order to create this world that we could step into. Really lovely. One of our
Thanks.
students also wants to know, they think that Chit Chat has really not been given enough of the spotlight, and they would like to know if you're gonna do a spin-off with Chit Chat.
So I mentioned briefly how I didn't love all the changes that they made to the movie, and one of the changes I didn't love was that there's no Chit Chat in the movie. Chit Chat is a squirrel, and she's very delightful, and she talks really fast, and a lot of kids really love that character. I love the character of Chit Chat, and I told the filmmakers, I was like, I get it. Maybe Chit Chat seems like a very minor character, but people love this character. You have to find a way to put Chit Chat in the movie, and technically, there is a squirrel in the movie in the backgrounds, and if you look, you'll see a squirrel here and there, and they call that squirrel Chit Chat. However, the character has no talk, has no dialogue. They don't say anything. We don't get to know them, so it's kind of like, well, it's not exactly what we wanted. That was kind of a bummer, but I don't know about a spinoff for Chit Chat. Maybe, I've thought about spinoffs for some of the characters. There's a character in the second book named Doctor Malovo who I thought might be an interesting character to explore. I thought about maybe a Bright Bill spinoff where we follow Bright Bill on a migration. Um, we'll see. I have other ideas too, so it's a little hard to know exactly how I'm going to spend my time. It's tough decisions.
One of the things that I really loved you showing us were your story maps and how you took just little
Mm.
snippets of ideas or thoughts and you could kind of, go different ways. Do you do that with each of your stories?
Yes, I started doing that with my picture books. It was really helpful for my picture books to kind of for me to I'm a visual person, so to be able to see a story kind of laid out in these little nuggets of ideas and be able to kind of draw an arrow from one to the next, or maybe rearrange things, and that was really helpful for me. And so when it came time to writing The Wild Robot, I thought I'm just going to keep going and do that same technique. I would do a story map for each chapter. I would do a story map for the whole big story, or maybe just a scene that lasts several chapters. There's no kind of wrong way to do it. Um, but it's just a way for me to organize my thoughts. And then eventually I figure out exactly what I want to happen. And so I can move on from there. But it's a big, important part of my process.
That's awesome, and it made me think that it might be for our students who think that they might wanna write a book or try writing a story. I thought it was a great way to show that you don't have to have the whole story already completed. If you just have some
Mm,
ideas, you can find ways maybe to thread them together by making these
yeah.
story maps, so I thought that was super cool. I also
Yeah.
wanted to ask, because everyone wants to know, are the other Wild Robot books gonna be made into movies?
Well, I don't know about all of them, but I know that definitely they're about to start a second Wild Robot movie. It takes a long time to make a Wild Robot animated film. Years. It'll probably be 3 years before this movie is out, but it looks like they're going to make the Wild Robot Escapes into an animated film. There's a chance it'll be called the Wild Robot, like Part Two or something like that. I'm hoping they'll stick with the Wild Robot Escapes, but I can understand why they might want to call it Part Two just for clarity. But anyway, they're still working all that out. But yes, I do think in a couple of years there will be at least one more Wild Robot movie. So stay tuned for that.
Awesome. And people wanna know what it's like to be a famous author. Do you get to ride around in limousines and hang out with movie stars?
Well, a little bit now that the movie was made, because like last weekend I was in Los Angeles for the Oscars. The Wild Robot movie was nominated for 3 Oscars, didn't win any, which was kind of a bummer, but it was still fun to go and be there. And a lot of the voices of the characters in the movie are played by like movie stars, like Lupita Nyong'o does the voice of Roz, and so I've gotten to hang out with her quite a bit. And I got to meet like one of my heroes, Mark Hamill, who is also known as Luke Skywalker, you know. So it's kind of fun. I get to occasionally be in a limo and occasionally hang out with a movie star, but my normal life, I live in a house in the woods. It's very quiet and peaceful, and it's not very glamorous at all. But I get to spend time doing what I love, which is writing and illustrating. So that makes me very happy.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. You have been an absolute inspiration, and we are excited for your picture book coming out. We
Yeah.
want to let viewers know also that there's another opportunity to see Mr. Brown on March the 30th. Libraries around Los Altos and the San Jose area are going to be showing the film The Wild Robot at 1 p.m. And then you can zoom in again with Peter Brown at 3 p.m. So go to siliconvalleyreads.org if you want to find out more information. But if today you were just captivated and you haven't seen the film yet, it might be a great opportunity to ask those questions after you see the film and you compare the two, the book and the film. So again, thank you so much for being with us, Mr. Brown. We have had so much fun with you and drawing and listening and inspiring. And I hope you have a wonderful weekend and we can't wait to see what you do next.
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for tuning in, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed hanging out with me. It's been a lot of fun. So happy reading to all of you, and take care. Bye bye.
Bye.